Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, Staying Connected, Tips and Tactics for Effective External Communication Despite Social Distance. I'm Melissa Keene. I'm a program manager with the Institute for Local Government, and I will be your host and moderator this afternoon. And I am working on my webcam. Here we go. Okay, so our webinar this afternoon is going to cover a few things. As local officials and staff work through this evolving public health crisis, it remains critical to share important updates, guidance, and mandates with your communities. Today's webinar will share strategies for consistently and authentically communicating with your community as we adapt to the new normal, prepare for the return to standard operations, and anticipate any future crisis events. The quick agenda for this afternoon, we're going to do this welcome and overview. I'm going to share a little bit of information about the Institute for Local Government. We have three presentations, one from Ryder Smith with Tripedi Smith and Associates, one from David Liebler with the California State Association of Counties, and one from Jesse Seitch with the El Dorado Irrigation District. We will then go into a quick panel discussion and then some Q&A with all of you. And then at the end, I'll make sure to share our contact information so you can follow up with us as needed. If you have a question during the webinar, you should see a questions box to the right-hand side of your screen in that control panel. You guys are all muted and will be for the duration of the webinar, but please feel free to type in a question at any time, and we will receive all of those and get to as many as possible at the end, and then again, we can definitely follow up as needed. A little bit about ILG. We are the nonprofit training and education affiliate of the League of California Cities, the California State Association of Counties, and the California Special District Association. We provide practical and easy-to-use resources for local agencies so they can effectively implement policies on the ground. So we offer training and education, as I mentioned, technical assistance, convening and capacity building resources for local governments statewide in a variety of issue areas. We have a program focused on sustainable communities, which helps local governments connect with cap and trade funding, work on energy efficiency projects, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, help with housing and land use issues. Our civics education and workforce program helps create that pipeline to public service and facilitate municipal school partnerships to help really foster an interest and pathway for students into local government service. Our leadership and governance program offers all of the state mandated trainings that local officials and staff have to comply with, like AB 1234 and harassment prevention. And then we also provide a number of resources and trainings around helping governments operate more effectively, build trust with their communities, operate as a better council team with their management team and things like that. And our public engagement program, of which this is kind of affiliated along with our leadership resources, helps local governments authentically and consistently engage with their communities on a variety of subject matters. So just a quick plug for some of our free resources. These are all online. We've recently developed a COVID-19 webpage that connects you guys to local government resources, state and national resources, has all of the executive orders related to this, tools and training opportunities, and then highlights a number of responses from what you all are doing in the field. Our leadership resources, as I mentioned, focus on things like effective boards and councils, decision-making and responsibilities and powers. And our public engagement resources, again, we have things on the basics. We have a whole public engagement framework to help embed public engagement into our communities, things about partnering with community-based organizations and language access, both of which are coming up as needs right now. So a quick snapshot of where we are right now. As of the 5th, there's a total of 14,336 positive cases in California, and you can see a breakdown of the ages listed there. And as we all know, we've been under a stay-at-home order since March 20th. A quick plug for our affiliate organizations here. The League and CSAC have both developed interactive maps to help you guys see the more localized and regional response, the emergency orders, the stay-at-home orders, things like that. And our affiliate CSGA has also created a web page of a number of resources. So we encourage you all to look at those if you're interested in more local information or just additional resources on this topic. So as I mentioned, today's presenters are Ryder Smith, David Liebler, and Jesse Seitch. Ryder has over 20 years of experience in government relations, technology, and marketing. He leads Tripeppi Smith, a 21-person communications firm with over 100 clients, including over 60 California public agencies. Ryder is also the creator of the City Internet Strategy Study, publisher of the Civic Business Journal, and owner of publicceo.com. A frequent speaker on the local government circuit, his insights have been published by industry-leading publications such as Western City Magazine and Public Management Magazine. He's a graduate from Claremont McKenna College in the San Gabriel Valley and is the vice chair of the Rose Institute of State and Local Government at CMC and a former planning commissioner for the city of Tustin, where he is sheltering in place with his wife and daughter. David Liebler has served as the Director of Public Affairs and Member Services for the California State Association of Counties for more than 2 decades. In this capacity, he oversees the statewide communications efforts for the association that represents all 58 California counties. Prior to joining CSAC, his career path took him from serving as a daily journalist to working as public relations consultant, where he specialized in media relations and crisis communications. And Jesse Seitz is EID's Communications and Media Relations Manager and acts as the district's primary spokesman. He has worked in communications positions at EID since 2006. Prior to that, Jesse held positions in the private sector, in the United States and Europe as a copywriter, editor, and teacher. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ryder for our first presentation.
Thank you very much, Melissa. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and thank you everyone for joining us on the call today. Let's go ahead and go to my next slide. So Tripeppi Smith, as Melissa mentioned, works with over 60 government agencies. The primary focus of those government agencies is cities in the state of California. We work with tiny cities like Indian Wells to large cities like Santa Ana, City of Tracy, Manteca. We work Grover Beach, Santa Paula, so we're all over the state of California. We also had the opportunity to work with some water agencies and have done a bit of work with counties. I only share this just to give you some perspective that a number of those existing clients have come and asked us to work with them on communications related to COVID-19. So we're seeing this, and I'll be offering comments mostly from the perspective of cities in California and what we're seeing it from a wide variety of different kinds of agencies in the state and from all over all regions. Next slide. So from my perspective, both in working with my city clients and from what I just see watching the news and taking in information like everybody else in this phone call, there's really these 5 broad areas that I see for each of the levels of government between the feds, the states, the counties, the cities, and the special districts, right? So the feds are out there providing us broad-based science and information from Dr. Fauci and their daily briefings, to the international work that they're doing with immigration and travel restrictions and things of that nature, and also trying to set some potential interstate issues or management. And then you have the states who are setting broad policies. They're using science. We're getting frequent briefings from Governor Newsom, and they're also experiencing fiscal impacts and trying to figure out how to address fiscal impacts at the state, county, and city level. At the counties, we're again more science, right? Our public health officers who are providing county by county guidance and direction on what's going on, what the latest stats are, the data that's being released, which only in the last week or so is maybe 2 weeks has really started to focus on city by city reporting with more localized information. They're outlining various policies. They're the ones that are coming to us and suggesting why we should not be wearing face masks and giving us lots of data points to pull from, which our public is eating up and absorbing. And then as cities are not typically in the position of having a public health officer, except for some of the larger cities out there, like a Long Beach. So the cities who often, though, have the strongest relationship to their communities are the ones who are in a position to offer truth. They're there to find facts and reiterate those facts and communicate those facts to their public. As cities are in a position to provide kind of what I call endurance, which is sustaining this effort to remain shelter in place or safer at home initiatives and get your public to buy in and be supportive of those. And obviously cities provide the bulk of life safety services, police, fire, emergency response. And we benefit because we're localized, and survey after survey shows cities benefit from having a lot of trust with their public. And this is certainly a time that is challenging trust in local governments. And because we have a lot of elected folks who are proximate to the individuals that are in our communities, it's also a chance for our cities to offer a tone of respect and appreciation for what we're addressing, and at the same time, providing some rays of hope and possibility for the future in our communities as well. And then, of course, our special districts undergird it all. And I often comment on the fact that at the end of the day, we still have clean running water. We still have toilets that successfully flush. And all the other very significant, if very quiet services that are provided by our special districts. And it's really an opportunity to, and by the way, there's lots of questions that surface around those with, is my water safe to drink? Or issues with people or using alternatives to toilet paper these days and the complications they're creating with sanitary sewer systems. But the special districts have an important role to play in all of this, particularly just reminding people that the fundamentals of civilization continue on that are going to allow us to recover out of the challenges that we're facing. So as I mentioned today, I'm going to focus some of my additional comments on cities if you want to go to the next slide. So I kind of break down the reality that we're facing from a communications perspective into these four phases of communications. We are pretty much at the end of the adaptation phase from what I've seen, at least in the state of California, since we jumped on this fairly early. This was scrambling for public agencies to figure out some sort of work at home arrangement and technology, how we had to assemble the right team of people to be communicators in particular around getting the information out. We saw people who were not previous PIOs having to put on PIO hats, while other people were focused on trying to deal with issues that might be more specialized for them, even if they were the designated PIO on an EOC plan. There were just fundamental issues of access and rights to certain primary assets or gaining access to social media channels and communication channels to be able to shove information out. There were lots of scrambling to figure out, okay, which tools are we going to use? How are we going to use the website to convey this? What are we going to get done? Because this was pretty unprecedented and not anything that anybody had really been anticipating, particularly executing on at the local government level. And then last but not least, learning at the same time. So one of the things that means is we had to all figure out what COVID-19 was, what we called coronavirus, and was it the novel coronavirus or coronavirus? So there was nomenclature issues to figure out. So we just had a ton of information to get wrapped around our heads and absorb as we learned about this disease, right along with our public. Now more into what I would call the sustained messaging process, which is we've got our feet underneath us. How do we sustain this effort, especially when we don't know what the indefinite period of time is that shelter-in-place orders are going to be in effect? We have to be in a position to explain the rules, continue conveying facts, not allow misinformation to get in the way of truth, and to provide and use our channels as communicators to pound that information out there as much as possible and make the public a part of the dialogue and discussion so that they understand what the facts are and they can respond to and interact with their government. The government, particularly governments, their local governments, the ones that they spend the most time around and proximate to. And I will just note too that one thing we need to think about is the whole order for safer at home has meant that our lives have become much more focused on what's immediately around us in our neighborhoods. So while it might be the case that previously when I could go out freely, my world was pretty much all of California, these days my world is very much the city of Tustin when it comes to where my interactions are, who I see, and it's brought everybody's focus to be hyper-local. I still think cities are also trying to identify their role as a city, and we see some cities that are spending more time talking about COVID-19 and explaining the health risks around that, and others who have completely said, I don't want to touch those issues. I'm going to head that off to my county or to the CDC, and I just want to focus on some pragmatic issues around taking care of our seniors. And then one other thing that I think is really starting to show up here is that we're starting to see cities turning a bit to, as part of the sustained messaging, how are we talking about hope? What kind of local success stories or stories of our community rising up to respond to the COVID-19 threat can we be celebrating and talking about locally to demonstrate good practices and where we go from here? So that's been very interesting to see among our clients. Now, this next phase is going to be interesting because we're going to be backing off these rules probably somewhat slowly, and that's going to come with resetting some community expectations and explaining what rules are now on and off the table. I think our public's gotten used to this idea that it's a dynamic environment, but we're going to be relying on that response to maintain this dynamic unwind as we look to the future and as we hopefully get out of safer at home orders. And then we're also, as we go through this phase out, we're going to be looking at economic development opportunities, how we try to promote our local businesses to sustain them for all the reasons that are important to community, not least of which is sales tax revenue generation. And I would also say that there is some element to here where we have to exit this anticipating that many health experts anticipate there's a second wave coming. So all the lessons we learned in the immediate adaptation phase may yet be put to work again, either in the fall or potentially as spring rolls around next year as well. And then finally, we're going to get into what I call the new normal phase, which is after we've gotten through these processes, there's going to be new social norms that are set. There's going to be a need to explain how city operations may have changed as a result of COVID-19, or how those operations may change as a result of budget constraints in the next couple of years. And we'll also be needing to identify how our city services might change. Maybe they've gone more digital. Maybe we're looking for virtual conferences only. So there's going to be a litany of things that we're going to have to explain to the public and kind of reorient them to how interacting and working with their city is going to change. Let's go to the next slide. So I just identified a few best practices that I've observed put into place so far. Number one, almost all cities that we're working with have created a COVID-19 portal of information on their website. Primarily within that, they're creating like a services dashboard. So if you think about a lot of cloud services, you can go on those services and see what's working and what's not. We recommend something like that for service dashboards as well for your public agency. This isn't just to educate your public on the things that are not operationally normal or might have changed, but it's equally important in my mind that we tell the public the things that are working successfully, so they are reminded that the dial tone of basic fundamental services in life, fire engines are working, police officers are finding bad guys still. The sewer system still works, the water system still works. We need to remind folks that these fundamentals are still in place and functioning, if maybe slightly altered in some cases. Things are so dynamic and changing that all the web updates you might be doing on your website should all be date timestamps so people know the last update on those. That would apply not just to pages that you're updating, but even to individual fact updates, because sometimes the frequently asked question answers are changing. So we'd urge that you date timestamp those specifically. I had this note in here about making the international local. The pandemic, in its own definition of pandemic, means it is an international event, but cities in particular are working on trying to explain that this is a pandemic that requires a local response. Individual action on your part can make a difference, and we see a lot of talk about trying to make sure that's clear and provide local examples to demonstrate that, to explain how the line at the Stater Brothers down the street and how they're having social distancing is helping to achieve our health goals as a society. It's also important for you to think about what your agency's lane is. What are you going to rely on the county to talk about? What are you as a city going to talk about? And how do you make sure you're not stepping into somebody else's or another entity's lane in terms of what they want to communicate about? I think an interesting example of this is that the CDC has embed codes that you can actually just grab whole chunks of COVID-19 content and use an iframe embed code on your website, and you don't even have to touch the content anymore, because as the CDC updates it, it automatically updates on your website. So that's a pretty interesting feature. We've seen a lot of cities set up hotlines. Of course, there are now a statewide hotline as well for seniors. So there's actually kind of some interesting confusion there that may exist between calling the city hotline for senior services versus the state's hotline for senior services, and explaining nuances is important. I think seeing the images of your local spokesperson, typically the mayor, maybe the city manager, or city staff working in an EOC, are important things to have. The visual is still very important. It doesn't have to be slick video, it can be basic video. Again, we're seeing a lot of cities implement and extend with ordinances, county policies. And then two final points. Zoom, I call it Zoom Fest 2020. Everybody and their cousin is using Zoom. I know there's been a couple security questions raised about it. From what I've read, those are relatively minor and generally require local access to the computer to cause problems. But it is interesting to see that Zoom has kind of become a de facto platform for a lot of government agencies. And I think that's impacting both how they're executing their city council meetings, and then how they also gather up as a group, as a city, to communicate with their own senior leadership teams. And then my last point here is just a general point that we all have a real desire to make sure people understand the significance and the importance of social distancing, but we cannot allow our language to get to the point where it instills fear in our community, because fear is going to lead to irrationality and all sorts of other nastiness. And you have to make sure you balance your language between concern and fear, and try to err on the side of concern whenever possible. Next slide. So my last examples here, and I'm actually going to paste these into the chat so you can click on some of these links directly, and you're not going to have to rely on pulling them off this, or maybe if I could rely on Randy on the ILG staff to paste it in to share with the group on the chat. But these are just 4 examples that I want to provide a shout out to. So the city of Manteca has been doing they've been doing briefings every day, and they do it in 3 different languages in their local community. And what I like about these videos is the fact that they're very consistent in producing them, but number 2, they're doing them basically the same content, 3 different languages to address 3 primary language spoken in Manteca, and they are not super slick productions. And that's not me denigrating them, that's me celebrating them for the fact that they feel very authentic and real. And so I think they're just really helpful to use. The second one is Manhattan Beach. They built out what, in my opinion, is one of the strongest COVID-19 portals of any local government agency that we are working with or that I've seen. It's very in-depth, very visually effective, and so I just think it's worth checking out. Note that they use a nice short form URL there with a /coronavirus to get to the content. The Grover Beach city manager did a really great video that's dead simple, again, shot personally by the city manager doing his own selfie video. But what I liked about his video is it was very authentic. It was kind of almost like a CNN reporter in the middle of a hurricane trying to report on a storm. But in this case, it was Matt Bronson coming to you from the local park, explaining where you should and should not be spending your time at the park. And then last but not least, the mayor in the city of Rolling Heights, Mayor Schmidt, did a great YouTube video that she shot on her laptop at home. She clearly took the time to make herself camera ready and look fantastic, but it was also very authentic because it came from her home and she spoke from her heart to the community about what was going on and called upon them to rise up and be great residents to help out their fellow community in America. And I think it's an excellent example of a well-produced mayor statement and what mayors can be saying right now. Final slide. So last but not least, I just wanted to note, so we have some additional resources available on our website. If you just go to trebepismith.com/coronavirus, we have all sorts of free resources that we made available there. I want to encourage you to check them out for free. If you have follow-on questions, our contact information is all there on the website. Obviously, we're going to answer lots of questions here today, but we really wanted to respond to this issue by taking all our minds and the things we were learning about and create a bunch of free resources so that we could help empower as many communicators and local agencies out there as possible. And if you see something we're missing or something you think we need to address, by all means, let us know about that too. We'd love to do anything we can to help contribute. Thank you for the time.
Thank you so much, Ryder. With that, I will just give a quick reminder that you guys can ask questions via the questions box at any point in time, and we're collecting those, and we'll get to those at the end of the webinar. And next up, I will turn it over to David Liebler with feedback.
Great. Thank you, Melissa, and thank you, Ryder, for that information. I'm here in Sacramento, and I'm wrapping up my 3rd week of working remotely. Like a lot of you, you're probably working out of your homes the last few weeks. It's a new dynamic. Being sheltered in place for day after day, social distancing, and within the context of all that, of having to do our jobs and working in a crisis situation. You know, crises are nothing new for California as local governments. In the last few years, we've seen devastating wildfires throughout the state, all the way from Riverside County up to Shasta. We've seen some of our counties have had multiple wildfires: Sonoma, Napa, Lake Mendocino, Los Angeles, Ventura. We've also seen debris flows that have just been absolutely horrible. We've seen a terrorist attack in San Bernardino County. And last year, we even saw electrical power shutoffs that affected more than 3 million Californians. But on top of all the crisis communications that we've faced over the years, we've never seen an issue like we're seeing today with COVID-19. Think about it. It's an international issue. It's a national issue, a state issue. It impacts all 58 counties. And it impacts all 40 million residents here in California. As I speak today, 53 out of our 58 counties have had positive cases of COVID-19. And it's been an issue that is just keeps going and going, and is in everybody's hearts and their minds. California counties have found themselves on the front lines on this battle. One reason, as Ryder pointed out, our public health officers are front and center on this. They're the ones that did the local shelter-in-place orders. and give a lot of direction about what people should be doing out of their communities. Counties are also involved in emergency management, public safety, working with our vulnerable populations, including the homeless. And because of the key role that they're playing on the ground level, counties play a major role in the public awareness and education that is coming out. Through public health, counties are responsible for getting the information out about what's happening in your community. And that's what people are really looking for information. How is COVID-19 impacting their community? Where are the cases popping up? How safe am I in my neighborhood? How safe am I going to my grocery store? Can I go to the local park? These are all questions that are on people's minds. And because we're stuck at home, people are looking at the internet and grasping information more than ever. And so it's incumbent upon us to make sure that the information is out there, but that it's very accurate and very timely. The same thing where we're constantly looking for ways we can educate the public and the media. With the media, it's been a feeding frenzy out there. You go to any website and almost every story this day has to do with COVID-19, and they're all looking for different angles about how to handle the situation. As I said, the media and the public are starving for information. They want it now. They want the latest information, and they want transparency. They want a transparency down to a level that may even be difficult to give. There's been a lot of requests of counties to be given information down to census tracker zip codes, to give the specific ages, to know where the neighborhoods where there might be an outbreak. And some of that has been a real challenge for counties because of the HIPAA violations that it could pose. So we have a number of challenges that we're facing out there as local governments. The first one is there's a fine line between getting residents to shelter in place and to social distance, but not to create hysteria. A few weeks ago, it was reported that Governor Gavin Newsom came out and said 56% of Californians could get infected with COVID-19. I think to a certain degree that was a scare tactic to try to get people to start following shelter in place and social distancing. It took a while for people to kind of get their arms around doing it. We saw the stories out there about people on spring break and some of their comments in Florida and Texas. We saw what happened to our parks and beaches the first week of shelter in place. They were absolutely flocked and people were not paying attention to social distancing. It's important to get the message out that to flatten the curve, we have to all do our part. But at the same time, we have to be really careful that we don't cause fear and hysteria out there amongst the public. There have been some incidents of that, thankfully, not as much in California. A couple weeks ago, I believe it was in an island off of Maine, there were 3 construction workers who had New Jersey plates that were working up there and renting a house together. And the locals saw it. They knew they were from New Jersey. They immediately thought they must be infected, and to keep them from going to work, they chopped down a tree to block their driveway. And when somebody came out, the locals surrounded them. Luckily, authorities showed up and calmed it down, but it just shows the level of fear that is out there. In one rural county, they asked the sheriff to patrol the entrances to the county and only let people that had a local address to be allowed in. Now, that isn't feasible, but again, it is a situation where we are on the edge of wanting to make sure that people do not sit there and do really crazy elements out of fear. So how do we sit there and get the word out about shelter in place, social distancing, wearing masks out in public, and all these other elements that are coming out? Social media is obviously a really big ticket. It's something that pretty much everybody is using. But keep in mind, there's a lot of people in California that don't have access to social media just because they don't have strong broadband capability. We also have a lot of older population that don't sit there and go on the internet and check out Google or CNN or Facebook or Twitter as much as you or I might. And so there's a question of how do you reach those populations as well? And I know a lot of you are dealing with that on a daily basis. And as I mentioned, there's the patient confidentiality issue. This is a health issue. There are laws that protect the confidentiality of patients, and it's really incumbent upon everyone to protect those and to not let so much information out that people can start identifying who are the individuals that have tested positive for COVID-19. Another one is different languages. In Los Angeles County alone, over 200 different languages are spoken. So how do you reach those languages? As Ryder mentioned a few minutes ago, cities and counties are coming out in different languages with translation. I saw one Facebook post where the county had a PSA and it had it in 3 different languages, kind of on top of each other, so you could click on one and get the language that you were tuned into. So it's always a challenge of reaching out all these diverse populations. And the last one is working remotely. It's a challenge we're all facing right now. How do you ensure your elected officials and key staff are prepared as coming from you as communicators? How do you make sure everybody's utilizing the same messaging? Gone are the days where we can just meet together in the Joint Information Center or sit around in the boardroom and hash out details in a strategy. Now we must do that all remotely. So I want to go through just some tips you might want to look at during this crisis. Some of them might be pretty self-evident, but I'm a firm believer to kind of reiterate some things that really work out there, because in a moment of crisis, sometimes it's easy to overlook them. The first one is work collaboratively. Work collaboratively within your local government agency and also with surrounding agencies. When the 7 Bay Area counties came out with a universal shelter-in-place order on March 16th, they, in Universal, sent out press releases together. They wanted to make sure the same message was going out across the board in the Bay Area. COVID-19 doesn't understand county borders. It doesn't understand city borders. So it's really incumbent upon counties and cities and special districts to work together as much as possible as they can do. And that is, as I mentioned, even within your own agency. I've seen some agencies create templates so that the different departments can use them to get their message out, but still has the same look that's being used within the local government agency so people know where it's coming from. It's important to find communication tools that work best for your agency and for the audiences you're trying to work. There isn't one size that fits all. We've noticed that Facebook tends to be a major way that local governments are communicating. And if you look at the demographics of people that use Facebook, it tends to be people that are a little bit older in age than those that use Twitter or Instagram. So it is a good way to hit other audiences instead of your 20-year-olds. I've also seen recently that you're starting to see some agencies starting to use something like TikTok to reach younger audiences. As you know, a lot of the people that we see out there that aren't practicing social distancing are people in their teens and 20s. They kind of, like we all did at that age, kind of had a cavalier attitude that, hey, nothing's going to happen to us. If we get it, we get it. But at the same time, they need to understand if they get it, don't have to just worry about them. You have to worry about their loved ones around them and their grandparents and so forth that could get it as well. When you're telling your story, be visual and simple. Sometimes in an era like this, when there's so much information flowing out there, simple and quicker is better. Keep your videos short, 15, 30 seconds in length. Nobody wants to sit down and watch a 3 or 4 minute video about COVID right now. Make sure your elected officials, if they are making statements out there, that they try to keep them brief and to the point. I think those will resonate a lot better. And as Ryder mentioned, they don't need to be professional. You can do them just off of your smartphone to set up. People just want the information and they want to be able to hear what's happening out there. They don't need Hollywood level productions. Make sure your elected officials play a key role through leading by example. They can be great in showing the way on sheltering in place, how they're working at home. They can show how they're doing social distancing. I've seen some press conferences, maybe not necessarily out of Washington, D.C., but I've seen some local press conferences where people are staggered 6 feet apart to show a point about social distancing. The elected officials can do PSAs. I saw a great one yesterday out of Contra Costa County. Supervisor John Joya was wearing a mask and he was telling people, hey, it's time we start looking at wearing masks when we go out there in public. So this is a time more than ever where our local elected leaders need to be stepping up and showing themselves as leaders. And I've seen that happen a lot around California, and it's really comforting to know, and I'm sure a lot of our residents feel the same way. As I mentioned, the public wants information. They want it quickly. They may be looking at their website constantly to see if the number of infected or the number of patients in local hospitals are going up. But you have to make sure that no matter how much information you're putting out there, you got to make sure that it is absolutely accurate and everyone is on point. So take that extra moment to really make sure that that information is working and you're not giving one message and one fact and figures, and maybe somebody else in your other agency is working off of something that might be a little bit outdated or a little bit different. All that's going to do is cause confusion out there and get to the point of, you know, how accurate and trustworthy is your information. When we're working remotely here, we have to look at how are we sitting and doing our internal communications with our internal groups. So try to see what you can do by working out a workflow that is really, really efficient and works for you and your agency. A lot of you probably already have that down in place. It took a little while, but this is a whole new era where we're working remotely, either through Zoom or through email or text or other ways to do it. I know some agencies for their communicators are using something like the WhatsApp app to communicate so that they can have short messages and texting and not sit there and be bogged down with all the other texts that they may be getting. Another tip is show the positives that are happening in your community. There's so much gloom and doom that's happening out there with the facts of figures when we see the number of infections going up and the number of the deaths that are going up. But this is also a time when our communities are pulling together. I've even noticed when I get a chance to go out and do a walk, even though people are a distant away or they see me coming and they make a 6-foot veer around me, but people tend to look at each other and smile and nod a little bit. We're all in the same boat. We're starting to see a lot of signs pop up about working together. A lot of kids are drawing signs and messages on the sidewalks in chalk. It's okay to show, and it actually is really good to show that your community is coming together and the positive elements that are happening out there. Never forget the importance of the human connection. It's something that I think a lot of us are finding is difficult to cope with in this shelter in place, but we need to make sure that we have a human connection, not only in our lives, but with our work mates. So that is really, really important, and try to do that with your colleagues to check in on. And a part of that is remembering your internal audiences. Your staffs are going through the same fears and the same concerns about themselves and their loved ones that the people we're trying to work with out there in the public are. So make sure they're doing okay. Check in with them regularly, see how they're doing. Everybody is coping with this crisis a little bit different individually. And while we're crisis communicators and we're local government officials, at the same time, we're human beings, and we can never lose that point in making sure that in these 15 or 20-hour days, and I'm sure a lot of people are working, that you know, they got to check in and make sure that everybody's still doing okay. And a very, very last important point I have on a tip is please take care of yourself. Your mental health is paramount. You can't do your job unless you have strong mental health. I've seen communicators and elected officials in crises before put in 15-hour, 20 days again and again and again. That wears down on you. Sometimes you're your worst enemy on knowing when you need to take that rest or that break. If you see somebody you're working with that's kind of getting into that zone and they need that, make them take it. They'll work better in the long run for it. And my very last point in all of this is we're all in this together. Remember that. Reach out to each other. If you need help on anything, reach out to the league, reach out to the California State Association of Counties or Special Districts Association. Reach out to each other. We're all learning on the fly on this. And it's really good to sometimes communicate and just see how are you doing, how are you working on this issue, and to trade some thoughts and strategies can really, really be helpful. With that, I say thank you for your time, and I'll turn it back to Melissa.
Perfect. Thanks, David. Definitely some helpful tips and reminders there. Our next speaker up is Jesse, and as some of you are probably also experiencing, we're having some broadband issues there. So he's joining us just via audio, no video on this one. So Jesse, take.
Thanks very much. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about sort of you were touched on in some of the concepts that Ryder spoke to, and David's tips. These are a number of the tools of the trade that we as communicators deal with when we're trying to communicate complex situations. And COVID-19 is certainly a doozy. Next slide. Just to situate, I work at El Dorado Irrigation District. That's in El Dorado County. That lighter shaded area is our service area. It's about 220 square miles. We offer a number of services. Next slide. Primarily water, wastewater treatment, recycled water. We have a hydroelectric power plant, and we offer recreation services. So you can see we have a little over 40,000 services for water, a little more than half of that in wastewater, and just a handful there, 5,500 of recycled water. That we serve approximately 125,000 people in El Dorado County. And that's right smack dab, kind of midway between Sacramento and Lake Tahoe. So we have areas in our county and our service area that are largely urban or semi-urban on the western end, and as you go farther east, it becomes much more rural as you get into the high foothills. Next one. Getting the word out. So we've covered these concepts. I just want to give you a little bit of the bones of what a small communications group in a special district like El Dorado Irrigation District deals with. I'm 50% of the team. I have one employee. We are a very lean organization in terms of that, and I suspect for a number of agencies across the state, maybe some of the folks who are listening in, that'll be something similar. So many of the traditional ways that we do get the word out: customer newsletter, website e-notification, Facebook pages and groups. We have a regional newspaper that's active in the area, local groups, chambers of commerce, and so forth. These are the traditional areas that any communicator leans on. Especially in this time of COVID, we are finding that we have to sort of knit together those alliances that we've had and make them even stronger. So when the pandemic started to become local as opposed to statewide and international, one of the first things that we do, what I did was, work with my local PIO group. There's a very robust group of PIOs that represent sheriff's department, city police departments. We have health department PIOs. We have hospitals. So we get together virtually, of course, now, and we talk about things. We get together and think about ways in which we can magnify our messages. Next one. But before we get there, let's talk about the reality of contacting an agency's customers. About a decade ago, we probably had about 6% of our customers' emails on file. This is pretty low. We made a concerted effort over those years, and today we have north of 80% of our customer emails on record. So we're able to communicate with folks in a very, very targeted way. They know that we will contact them when we need to have to get them vital information, not for spam, not to just give them the latest rebate, but when we really need to let them know that there's a water main break, or there's a wastewater line break, and we need to be wary. We've sort of engaged in a back and forth that allows them to understand this is a channel that we will not abuse, and we've had a high amount of success with it. So we have an immense number of folks that we can just, at the drop of a hat, go ahead and send a message out to. Next slide. So what I would really talk about here, and before we get into sort of questions and answers, again, a lot of the tips that David had spoken about are right on. You really have to find your audience. In El Dorado County, and especially in the areas around our service area, I've found particularly powerful are Facebook groups that, as you can see in this slide, and they're all basically El Dorado, they're the watch group or an incident information post or emergency and information page. These are all active pages about a topic that people are really concerned about, their community. And you'll note that top group, El Dorado County Watch, has nearly 40,000 members. 21,000 on the incident information post, and of course about 15,000 on the other. What this is, this for me, and some of the PIOs in our area, we've been able to really magnify our message by going on here, and not only that, spend time to get to know the influencers that are maybe moderators of these forums. If you get to know these folks, they're ready to magnify your message. Next slide. Successful messaging, we know what it is. We've heard that. We all understand the nuts and bolts of that. What I guess I would highlight here and what's worked for EID is, especially on social, each conversation is fundamentally a public meeting. It's a de facto public meeting. In that light, be available. It's easier said than done. I'm a salaried employee, and I have an hourly employee who works for me. And there are budgets, and everybody has to worry about these types of things. That said, when you've had a public meeting for a rate increase, and you've had 30 people attend a large meeting hall, and your actual reach, your shares, and and the folks that are commenting on a Facebook or other social channel post is in the tens and hundreds, they become de facto public meetings of a type. So I am available. If we have an emergency, much like we do now, if someone asks a question and I happen to be up, I will be answering that question. And you can see in this example here, Mr. Olivares had asked us, are you going to suspend rate increases and lowering the rates? Great. We had a long conversation about that back and forth, and it's understandable. Folks are anxious about a number of things, back and forth. And he said, I really appreciate that you guys are responding so fast. That's what folks want. They want to know that they're being heard. They want to know that their questions or their concerns are reaching people. And that's what the immediacy of some of these social platforms are especially useful in doing. We use Facebook primarily for demographic purposes, especially. But these are places where people are at. Even if the broadband doesn't go as deeply into the foothills as some places, there are enormous number of folks that have plans on their smartphones. They're doing it in a mobile way. Next slide. Customer response. Again, there are a number of things I could have highlighted, but I really want us to think about, we're all dealing with this, especially in the internal part of the organization and the folks that we're trying to serve. One of the things that is exceedingly powerful is sharing your gratitude. And there's a postcard that was sent in to our company, and it said, "To all the hardworking EID employees who help to keep the community up and running, a big thank you." That was huge. I got on Facebook, I shared that. A large number of folks came on to really appreciate that. They liked it. They shared it with others. What we need to do now, in addition to sharing the information that we have that we need to get to our communities, share the gratitude, because it fosters empathy that is sorely needed in our in this time. Next. And I'm going to end on another positive. To be honest, again, our folks in our service area have been really, really supportive. They've responded well, and again, like the others have said, the dry runs have been PSPS. The dry runs have been, hey, I now have to think about my water district more than I have ever thought about you before. As long as we're able to remain a trusted source of information, one that's transparent and gives them the information that they need in as human a way as possible, I think that we're really going to get through this. So with that, I want to leave some time for questions, but I'll just say thanks for listening, and I hope everybody washes their hands.
Great, thank you, Jesse. As another reminder to everybody on the line, if you have a question, please feel free to type that into the questions box. We've received a couple, but if there's more out there, please send those in to us at any time. We have a couple of discussion questions just to get the ball rolling while you guys give you all a chance to type your questions in. So the first question we have up is, this pandemic has increased the public's desire for information from all levels of government. How did you or are you adapting to meet that increased need? Maybe, David, you can speak to this from a county perspective?
Sure. Like I mentioned earlier, this crisis is bringing up new challenges almost daily for local government. And from a county perspective, I think one of the major challenges is getting the information that the media and the public is really seeking in terms of how much is their communities really impacted by COVID-19. And I think you've seen that a ramp up over a period of time. There's been a number of counties that have now put COVID-19 dashboards on their website, so you can go and you can actually break it down to the city level. At the same time, they need to be really careful that they don't break it down too much, so that individuals that might be infected could potentially be identified. Sacramento County today came out with a breakdown by a zip code, but they didn't identify any zip code areas that might have had less than 5, just because then you really start narrowing down for the people. So I think counties are finding new ways of getting information out in a way that they've never had to, and utilizing new tools. When you start looking at board meetings, city council meetings, how are they be done remotely? That was all new. Nobody's ever done that before, or had to do it in that sort of way. How do you do Q&As with an elected official over Zoom for the public when you're asking the question and your county official is 75 miles away and working through all that sort of technology? So I think there's been a really big learning curve on a lot of fronts, but at the same time, you're starting to see an enormous amount of information that is being just put out there on a daily basis.
Great, thank you. Ryder or Jesse, any additional thoughts on capacity or how you're adapting to meet increased need?
I'll defer to Jesse first.
Yeah, I think it's simply it's what I touched on before, is reforging those ties that we all have. When I can get together with the chambers of commerce who will magnify messages into the business community, when I can sit with the PIOs and say, hey, these are the things that are important to my organization. This is the way that we're finding that we're going to have to pivot. Can you help me here? The pandemic is not only increasing sort of a desire for information, but it's increasing sort of like just the breadth of information. So we're putting, like everybody else, we've got a COVID dashboard. It's really getting the information that's most important to your constituencies. For us, is our water okay? and don't flush wipes. Don't flush anything that isn't bodily waste and toilet paper. So yeah.
And I would just chime in with a broad philosophical point, which is we are asking government, no matter what level, is asking our public to do something that's unprecedented and to give up serious liberties. It is only natural that in exchange, that public is going to want information, lots of information. And what stands between information that's gathered and the public is the communicators, many of whom are on this call right now. But we need to understand that dynamic is creating a lot of tension out there. And I can respect that there's HIPAA issues, and I understand there's legal issues with that, but you could also understand why the public is clamoring to get access to that information, even if it might present a false sense of security because of the ease with which COVID-19 can spread. It's still emblematic of their I guess, perception and their human need to have access to information in a very dynamic and scary situation.
Great, thank you all. We did receive a question about engaging local officials on social media and the implications of the Brown Act. That's definitely a question I would suggest that you reach out to your internal counsel, whether that's your city attorney or your county counsel or general counsel, to make sure. There are, to my understanding, no real bright line rules around the Brown Act and that, aside from limiting their commenting on other posts and things like that. Do any of you all have any expertise you want to share around the Brown Act and local officials?
I'll offer one quick perspective, which if you can, it can be very awkward trying to make sure you help your public officials avoid getting in trouble with the Brown Act, because at the same time, they want to be communicators. So I would urge that you use your social media policy that you already likely have in place or hopefully are developing or have developed as kind of the guidepost to help your elected officials stay on the right side of the Brown Act when it comes to social media interactions in general. And also the second point I would make is I always encourage our elected officials to usually decent social media reach, indeed oftentimes better than the public agency that they're elected to represent or to serve on. They always have really into the community. So one of the greatest roles for an elected official to play is to take some fact-based information coming from the public agency that they serve on the board of and regurgitate that information to the public and make sure they add a layer of direct, of a representative elected official who's kind of recognizing the important role of the factual information and also recognizing and reminding the public that this is still a democracy in America and we haven't slipped into some slippery slope of fascism where, things are going to go awry in the next 6 months or something like that.
Great, thank you. From a time check perspective, we're almost at 3, so I'm going to go ahead and advance the slides to our contact information in case people need to drop off. But there's a couple more questions that if you all have time, we can definitely try to get to.
Sure.
Great.
So there's another question around that cities are posting pretty much everything possible, SBA resources, changes in the deadlines for the Real ID, SBE, gas company policy changes, a whole host of things. The question is, what is too much? How much information is helpful to put out? Are we overwhelming our residents and our community with all of this information?
Well, I'll go real quickly on that one. While there is such a focus on COVID-19 and the information surrounding that, local government is still continuing, and it's important that people understand that. From the county perspective, everything from behavioral health to child protective services to, certifying an election. And it seems like forever ago that we had the March primary, and it was just over a month ago. Those are still going on and people still want to access services. So I think it's really important for the public to understand and know what is open, how to get a hold of it. Some of it's by appointment only. And I think getting that information out to the public, even if it's a static way by making sure it's on your website, is really, really critical.
And along those lines, I would particularly agree with the point of reminding people that all these services are continuing. So I wouldn't, it's important for people to know that life goes on and the fundamentals are still in place. You cannot talk about that enough. And even if it seems like you're celebrating something boring, like the water is clean and healthy, of course, in the scheme of things, clean water is not boring. That's actually super exciting, and thank God for it every day. But those are important things to remind the public about. I do think that given the sheer volume of change and dynamic environment around government action, both at the state and the federal level, cities are a little bit better positioned. The city staff folk are better positioned to understand the three-letter acronyms that go along with all this stuff and the nuances and the layers of government and who's doing what. That when it comes to things like helping your local businesses navigate to access and resources, there are some city staff who are just understand the machinations of bureaucracy and government that can help be a little bit of a Sherpa along the pathway of getting access to information. And there is a role to play, I think, for city staff to be helpful in doing that. It can be a huge amount of information, but partnerships with your local chamber and helping your public know where they can go get access to those resources is really helpful. I'd also say that the state caught up on this a couple of weeks ago when they launched their COVID-19 portal themselves and did a much better job of starting to consolidate information and recognizing it as a jump-off point for engagement with the public. And that's made it easier to refer people to another source to get some additional information.
Perfect, thank you. We have a question about using Zoom for public meetings. I'm sure we've all seen the news about the Zoom bombing and things that are happening on that front. So the question is about if there's any concerns for you all about using Zoom for public meetings. One quick note before I turn it over to the panelists, we also hosted a webinar last week on some of these open meeting issues and public records requests and government operations side of things. We did touch on this a little bit, so please feel free to check out the recording of that webinar on our website as well. That might give you some good insight. But David, Jesse, Ryder, any thoughts on Zoom for public meetings?
No, not offhand. I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but after there was some initial episodes, not only here in California, but elsewhere, that I believe Zoom put some tightening of some controls in place to kind of limit the ability about what that could happen. It's really important for the public to know that their government is still functioning, and a way of doing that is to be able to see the elected bodies still functioning and meeting. In this day of social distancing and the public not allowed into the chambers, it's a little bit hard to do it otherwise than to have it through video conference calls. And Zoom just seems to be, everybody's using Zoom now, so it's inherent, I think, for local governments to be able to sit there and still do the people's business on a weekly basis.
I believe, David, you are correct that Zoom implemented a couple of fixes. There's also been a couple just operational implementations that have been guidelines that have shared around how to better secure your Zoom meetings to avoid some of the Zoom bombing and things like that have taken place. So it's not that I would recommend against Zoom. There are certainly alternatives out there. There's a lot of Microsoft shops in the local government world that are using Microsoft Teams. The city of Hayward is one of those examples of the city using Teams to broadcast their council meetings. One of my clients is using Uber Conference, which is one of my preferred platforms. It only goes up to 10 video streams, but it's just a great platform for handling kind of conference calls and managing the issues when somebody puts you on hold and whatnot. So there's certainly lots of platform options out there. It is interesting how Zoom is just kind of taken off as a go-to for a lot of people, and they're certainly feeling the stress and the growth. I think they had a 500% increase over 1 month in their volume.
Yes, I've heard the same thing that David and Ryder just mentioned, that they are doing some security patches and things like that to make sure that those meetings are a little bit more locked down than they were initially. We have another question going back to some of the capacity issues. The question is, it takes a skillful level of research and writing skills to develop and articulate messaging without a dedicated PIO in a small city. What would you advise? Having rotate around staff members, pros and cons of that, or any other suggestions on that front?
I would say that when I got into my organization, it's essential that the tools we use in communication are shared. I conscripted entire departments of folks into the arcane ways of communication. So if you have a small team or have few resources, it's vital to sort of be able to get a little bit of training, perhaps in some of the field work of public communication, and it can work. If you don't have the resources, it'll be necessary for you to be able to stand up some folks to be able to address things like that.
Yeah, I agree. There are a lot of cities and a lot of small counties that just don't have the resources to have a dedicated PIO, and often it falls on somebody that really doesn't have necessarily the training or the background in that area. It becomes equally difficult for that individual in a time of crisis. I would say just whatever you can do for those individuals to try to get some training in advance. Have them attend things like the Capio annual meeting, or join Capio and do the webinars. Anything that has to do with any sort of associations that have to do with public communication would be good. Or to reach out to other people that are involved in the field to learn how to do anything as simple as media relations. Media training is really, really big, but a lot of people don't really understand the ins and outs of that. So I would say don't wait till a crisis before you try to get that training under your belt.
And just a quick note on what David just mentioned about Capio. I have seen them releasing a number of webinars that are free to people even outside of their membership to help in some of these crisis situations. So you may want to check that out also, just as a potential additional resource, even if you aren't currently members of the association. So we have another question, and this kind of gets to the balancing of regular agency communications needs with some of the crisis communications pieces. The question is, we have been working on an impending water rate increase that'll go into effect in fiscal year 2021. What are some suggestions, thoughts about how to approach this strategically considering the current environment?
Yeah. We're right there, right in the middle of a Proposition 218 process to raise rates. We were able to have one public meeting, sort of an open house / public public forum for folks to come out and look at the types of projects that are tied to the need for additional funding and the rate adjustments. But that's a huge problem. So we have one more public meeting we're planning to do virtually later this month. So it's going to be difficult. A lot of people's minds aren't on the idea that their water or sewer rates may be rising. So we're doing in terms of EID, we're going out of our way and doing just everything that we can to be able to get that information in front of folks. We do that anyway, but in this time where folks are really divided, yeah, it's challenging for sure, and it's ongoing for us.
I would just observe that there's a very interesting challenge right now in that, on the one hand, there are cities who want to do nice things for the community or try to be helpful or do some of the programming, and they're hemmed in by their operational risks associated with not spreading COVID-19, or they're concerned that they're going to look like they're being too happy-go-freely in the middle of a crisis. So that balancing edge is really difficult, and obviously it's not happy-go-lucky to be talking about a water rate increase, right? That's just the fundamentals of operations must go on. But in the due course of general city communications, those challenges are definitely out there, and you got to be careful that the optics of having a social media post on the one hand talking about your first COVID-19 death in the city, and then the very next post is try our virtual online Roomba classes or Samba classes or something, like the optics on that can be pretty challenging. So you have to be cognizant of the world that you're communicating in.
Perfect, thank you. So we just got one more question about, this also goes back to the Brown Act question. So let me know if you guys want to handle this. But it's, how have you seen agencies handling the revised Brown Act, and what should agencies be aware of to still be transparent and abide by the rules? Again, I would definitely point to the webinar that NOG hosted last week. We talked a lot about the Brown Act, had an attorney and a city clerk speaking to both the legal guidelines as well as the practical application of that. So that might be a good place to start. But do any of you guys have any thoughts on Brown Act issues more broadly?
I'll defer to the other two guys on the panel on that.
Yeah, no.
Not offhand, no, really. I would just say, you know, consult with your city attorney or your county council on anything. There's a lot of different interpretations about the Brown Act that are out there and from individual attorneys. And so to make sure you're just following with exactly what they want to do.
I will note that there was an effort last year legislatively to start addressing some of these vague areas in the Brown Act. And unfortunately, that piece of legislation died. I believe Teresa Stricker at RPLG has been tracking on that issue. She and I had done a panel on that last year at the League Annual Conference, and I believe it's back alive again currently, although the chance that any legislation beyond COVID-19 is going to get handled this year is somewhat unimaginable, or things dealing with the budget crisis. But that remains a big concern and point of frustration. I wish they would come up with some legislative addressing for this issue to bring clarity.
But yeah, if you ask that question and want to follow with me separately, I'd be happy to point you in the direction of ILG's resources and information on that front, because it's kind of a whole separate can of worms that I don't think we're equipped to address today. Okay, so that kind of takes care of all of the questions that we've seen come in. Just from a closing thoughts perspective, would love to hear from our panelists any kind of advice you'd have for your communications colleagues, or anything that you want to share as closing remarks.
I'll go real quickly. Just stay safe out there. Make sure you have mental breaks and feel free to reach out to anybody. You're not alone. There's a lot of people in the same position. If you ever feel overwhelmed about something, there's a lot of people that may feel the same way. And I don't want to use the phrase misery loves company, but don't be afraid to reach out to other people and colleagues in your area to kind of maybe get a little bit of a barometer check sometimes.
Yeah, along those lines, I would just note there's been a number of just spontaneous conference call groups that have popped up that are allowing people to quickly navigate and share experiences. I'm on a call with about 30 city managers every Wednesday, discussing through some issues. There's regional PIO groups that are getting together, doing phone calls, trying to collaborate, and you know, to some extent that makes sense because they're all operating under the same rules from their public health officer in their county. So there's some regional benefit as opposed to just blanket statewide stuff that gets you a little bit more granular. And then the second point I would make is, you know, unprecedented times, it's obvious. The expectations of government are very heightened. The expectations for those agencies communicating are significantly raised for all the reasons I cited before about the expectations of the public that they're being communicated to and getting access to information when they're being asked to not do certain things like leave their house. This is both an opportunity for government to effectively shine and deliver and be great communicators. It's also a chance to engage in our public in ways that we'd always hope we get a chance to engage with them, at least in actually having interaction and interest in what government's doing. And the risk of all that is it's also a huge opportunity to fall short and fail and cause their first interactions or their first deep interest in government to become one of frustration. So execute carefully and thoughtfully and try to be an effective communicator that gets the information out that the public is clamoring for.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure I can add anything beyond, you know, reach out to your area groups. There's more help that wants to be given It's, the folks want to share their experiences and what's going on together. And just be well, be careful, and make sure you put the oxygen mask on you before you put it on anybody else.
Hopefully we won't meet.
Yeah.
Perfect. So with that, we will be sending around the slides and the recording from this webinar in a couple of days. So keep an eye out for that, that you can share with your colleagues, and we'll post it on our website as well. And so please join me in thanking Ryder and David and Jesse for sharing their experience and expertise today. We really appreciate it, and hope everybody stays safe and healthy.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.